Most species are rare. The number of species that are common and that we see around us every day is a tiny, tiny fraction of all biodiversity. Here in Italy, for example, there are around 7,000 vascular plant species. But the number of species that I see around me on a daily basis, or that I can identify, is in the order of only several hundred. Most of Earth's biodiversity is quite naturally scarce and difficult to find because most species are ecological specialists that occupy quite specific habitats and niches within those habitats. However, these ecological specialists, because of their specialization, are often those at greatest risk of extinction, and it is difficult to understand which species are just naturally scarce but actually doing fine, and which are at risk of extinction. Which populations of which species actually need help? When I see populations of rare plants, the first question that springs to mind is this population too small? Is a group of 5 plants, 50 plants, 500, 5,000 enough to guarantee conservation? Small populations face a range of problems. Firstly, because the death of just a few individuals represents a relatively large proportion of the local population. Also because the individuals tend to breed just amongst themselves, and like a marriage between cousins, this inbreeding can lead to low genetic variability and developmental problems. And particularly for flowering plants, if there are fewer plants in flower, the visual impact of the population is less, meaning that the group of plants is less attractive to pollinators. And when pollinators arrive, they tend to move just short distances between closely spaced and closely related plants, exacerbating that problem of inbreeding. Perhaps the best way of understanding if a population is too small is to look at how effectively biological processes work. In other words, if things like flowering, fruiting, seed production, seed germination, and seedling establishment are all happening. Are the plants completing their life cycles? Is there what we call recruitment of seedlings into the local population, like the recruitment of soldiers into an army? We can also examine less visible phenomena such as the genetic diversity of the population. Crucially, by comparing these parameters across a range of different populations with contrasting population sizes, this can tell us the threshold population size below which processes are more likely to fail. A number of scientific studies on a range of different species shows that each species has its own threshold population size below which we see biological impacts. So there's no magic population size for all of conservation, and we need to consider each species separately. In this particular study, we're looking at the marsh gentian, Gentiana pneumonanthe, in heathland about 16 kilometers or 10 miles north-northwest of Milan. What is the population size, or the number of visible, mature, flowering adults, below which processes start to fail? In our case, we compared marsh gentian populations across a range of population sizes, in fact 18 populations encompassing just a few individuals to several 100,000 individuals, in small fragments of habitat to extensive, well-preserved and well-connected areas in both heathland and humid meadow habitats. Part of the problem is not simply how many adult reproductive plants there are, but also if the vegetation is sufficiently open that small seedlings can establish, something that depends on regular management of the habitat, in practice cutting or burning of the vegetation. Populations can be composed of large reproductive plants, but if the vegetation has developed or successed to a point that these plants are now found underneath bushes and trees in remnants of abandoned grassland, then there's little hope for seedlings to become established. These are what we call regressive or senile populations, as opposed to populations with normal demographics. So we needed to understand the relationship between the young individuals relative to adult plants. We did this with field surveys, counting not just the adults, but also different stages from seedlings to non-flowering juveniles through to mature adults. Essentially, lots of seedlings equals a healthy population. We also looked at how effective reproduction was, how many individuals in each population produced healthy pollen, and whether pollen was successful in its job of fertilizing the female parts of flowers. We looked at seed production, and where the seeds actually germinated. So with regard to pollen, we found that some of the smallest populations showed high rates of pollination, up to 100%. Here, for example, we can see pollen grains on the female receptive surfaces of flowers, the stigma, and we know that the pollen is working correctly and doing its job because by treating the flowers chemically and looking using ultraviolet light, we can see the pollen growing in the form of these so-called pollen tubes, which we see here in bright blue. And they grow towards the ovules, which are the structures which will eventually become seeds. Each pollen grain fertilizes a single ovule, and the result is an embryo with the ovule and embryo developing together to become a seed. This is where the story gets interesting. Pollination dropped off drastically at a threshold of below 7 reproductive adults, which would suggest that populations can be extremely small and pollination can still happen. But for successful fertilization, which we can see as the production of an embryo within the seed, the threshold was 42 flowering adults. Also for seed germination, successful seed germination was more likely above 42 adult individuals in the population. In other words, small populations may set seed, but when population size falls below around 42 mature individuals, this seed is less likely to contain an embryo capable of growing. Of course, we're not suggesting that 42 plants is an ideal target population size. This is an absolute minimum size below which it's highly likely that processes start to fail. And we should be aiming to keep populations well above this lower limit. Many remnant populations are in the order of 50 to 150 individuals, so to the casual observer they may appear to be healthy populations, with bees taking pollen between flowers, fruits being produced, and even some seedlings becoming established, but we know that the seeds are not as healthy as they could be, and these populations are teetering on the brink of reproductive failure. In other words, most of the populations found around Milan. For populations of just a few individuals, it's evident that the vegetation is so far developed that only drastic intervention in terms of both management and population reinforcement may possibly help. In other words, opening up the vegetation and producing plants to put back at the site, to add to the natural population. But it can also be argued that a population such as this is effectively extinct, a dead man walking. In ecology, we call this extinction debt, a lag between a detrimental environmental change and the death of the last individual of an affected species, and local extinction. This is a particular problem for longer-lived perennial species where large individuals can persist for decades, despite the environment no longer being suitable for completion of the life cycle or seedling recruitment. To understand if extinction debt is occurring, it's important to understand the process of succession or vegetation development, and to understand at what point along the succession the rare target species typically becomes established. For the marsh gentian, Gentiana pulmonante, seeds must fall on open soil in early succession after a disturbance such as cutting or fire. And although adult plants grow alongside larger species such as the purple moorgrass, Molinia caerulea, or heather, Calluna vulgaris, the succession must be reset periodically by disturbances to avoid woody shrubs and then trees taking over. So active vegetation management is crucial, but another thing we can do to encourage the populations that we've identified as particularly at risk is reinforcement. This essentially involves understanding how to propagate plants, cultivate them, and then put them back into the wild alongside the naturally occurring plants. As vegetative or clonal reproduction methods would artificially select just a few individuals, leading to low genetic variability, sexual reproduction by seed is the preferred method, ideally starting from hand pollination, transferring pollen widely throughout the population, followed by sowing of seeds directly onto open soil within the habitat, as the seeds and plants that live or die will be naturally selected and so be the most appropriate individuals for the local situation. However, we found it impossible to follow the progress of seeds sown in this way, and the journey from seed to flowering adult can take many years. So we sowed the seeds in the laboratory, under highly controlled conditions that allowed us to avoid complications, and found that for this species it was actually relatively easy to germinate the seeds and cultivate the plants to produce large numbers of plants, which isn't always the case for native species. The plants we produce were then used to reinforce various populations, aiming to add way more than 42 plants to each. In practice, we typically added between 100 and 150 plants at 11 sites. The plants were planted in grids, which were marked with iron nails so that we could find the corners with a metal detector. This is practically the only way to allow monitoring of the survival of individual plants in the future, finding them again and following their progress. To understand that the plants that we find 10 years after are actually those we produced, and this allows us to calculate a survival rate. I wanted to end this video on a positive note. But something's happened and I have to talk about it now. So even though we have some wind and the cars passing and a bit of noise in the background, I feel that I have to talk about this right now. So what happened is this. I came back to this site this morning to take some extra photos and extra videos of the marsh gentian, and I found it all in flower and everything was fine. It was a bit too wet, so I decided to come back later on in the day because the flowers were all closed and to protect the pollen, and I wanted to get the flowers nice and open. So I came back later on in the day. When I came back, I found that the whole place had been cut. In fact, the tractor that was mowing this area just left through that corner of the field. This illustrates an important point in vegetation management and plant conservation. That the management, particularly cutting like this, must be done at an appropriate moment in the life cycle of the species you're trying to protect. Here, I won't mention the name of the park, but the particular site we're in is known for being the site with the gentian and the parasitic butterfly, Phengaris alcon, which only lays its eggs on the marsh gentian and can only live here. So this is like the crown jewel of the entire park right here, and it should be managed appropriately, specifically with those organisms in mind. The problem is that there's a difference between what the biologist sees and the understanding the biologist has and the recommendations that the biologist makes to the park, and then the administrators and the directors of the park. Essentially, when directors and people that are in charge of spending the money, when they get the money, they spend it. When they get money to pay somebody to come and cut, they spend the money and somebody comes and cuts. But it doesn't necessarily match up with the life cycle of the organisms that supposedly they're trying to protect. So what's happened here is that the last population of gentian in this park, because the other sites haven't been managed and now they're overgrown, the last population has just been cut. So I can understand why in the last couple of years we've seen the disappearance of the butterfly, Phengaris alcon. I can understand why, despite actively putting time and money and lots of people into reinforcing the populations here, I can understand why there's only a small group of plants which are essentially here. Okay? I can understand why the whole thing is failing. If the people that are managing the sites don't understand the biology or don't listen to the biologists, then they do the work and spend the money in an inappropriate way. It's a waste of money, big waste of money. This is after 8 years of project, okay? 8 years since we put the plants back here to reinforce the population. So essentially 10 years since the project started. And I have to say, personally, it's a huge disappointment. And I can talk about conserving plants, population sizes and things like that, kind of the scientific side of conservation biology. But essentially one of the main problems is communicating or getting people to understand, those people being the people that actually manage and administrate the project and the work and the park. And that's probably one of the main problems in conservation, getting them to listen, getting them to understand the life cycles and not interrupting the life cycles in an inappropriate way, which is precisely what's happened here. And I think it also illustrates a wider problem in society that everyone talks about protecting nature, everyone wants to protect nature, everyone says that they do it, and we have projects and set up parks to protect nature. But the amount of funding that's available to protect nature is negligible with respect to other things. And then that funding is not usually applied in an appropriate way, in a long-term way. Usually it's done project by project, which means like a small 2-year, 3-year project, and then nothing. And when you think that very often these habitats and these species relied in the past on traditional management, which was a year-by-year thing, people coming out and using the land, cutting the vegetation, extracting minerals from the soil, that kind of thing, and it was a regular, periodic disturbance, which actually encouraged certain types of vegetation. Nowadays, it's managed, it's cut, it's kind of done, but not in a regular way, not in an appropriate way, not at the right time. And despite everyone saying that they support nature conservation, despite everything being green, what actually happens is that there's very, very, very little that's done that's actually of any value. And I didn't want to end this on a bad note, on a downside, but I think that it's something that we can improve if we can talk to administrators, get them to actually understand. That can improve things. It's probably the main thing that we can do to encourage biodiversity conservation. I also wanted to do this as a kind of personal note because it's something that I've seen and been battling with, also psychologically, to get over this problem that we do a lot of work and then it just disappears into smoke. So it's something that I wanted to express. It's definitely something that you can learn from, at least. Okay. So on that note, thank you for watching the video, and hopefully the next one will be a bit more positive. Maybe next year I'll come back here, we'll have talked to the administrators of the park and they'll do the management at the right time, and maybe next year we'll see an improvement of the situation for this particular species. Thank you very much. Goodbye.